My name is Viktoria Pashtriku, and I am a master's student here at Gallatin, where I study human rights, collective memory, and transitional justice. My work focuses particularly on post-conflict Balkan region of Europe, with an emphasis on post-war Kosovo. In particular, for both my master thesis and for the work I did for the fellowship, I'm interested in exploring and understanding the ways in which the post-conflict structures and systems of transitional justice tackle wartime sexual violence. During the Kosovo War between 1998 and 1999, it is generally estimated that around 20,000 men and women were victims of wartime sexual violence. Despite this large number, both international and local state actors failed in their attempts, or lack of attempts, to protect survivors and offer them support needed to rehabilitate and continue their lives for the following the war. This occurred in several ways. First, because the Kosovo War was largely a liberation effort which sought independence for the Albanian community and people in Kosovo, when women's groups attempted to fight for policy to support survivors in the immediate post conflict environment, they were accused by a lot of the Albanian elites as attempting to deter the narrative and the dialogue away from independence and that to women's issues, and therefore harming all of the Albanian people. Um, Meanwhile, the United Nations mission in Kosovo, which had a leading role in governing Kosovo in that initial decade after the war, also failed to take into consideration the protection and rehabilitation of survivors of wartime sexual violence. This included negligence at the trials at the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where several issues happened, such as the anonymous identities of survivors who testified being released to the public. But this also meant failing to establish legislation in post war Kosovo for survivors of wartime sexual violence, along with the other legislation that they drafted. Understandably, survivors of wartime sexual violence and advocates in this time lost trust in both the local state as well as the international community to support them. This along with the stigma of and shame that surrounds sexual violence, meant that for a long time in post-war Kosovo, survivors remained silent, and all of the work to help them fell on the shoulders of women's civil society groups. The map you see right here gives you a greater sense of the sexual violence that occurred during the war. The shades of blue tells you where darker regions and more sexual violence happen, and the red dots are actual cases that have been reported of sexual violence. We don't, although there's a 20,000 number, a lot of people don't speak out, so only about 280 have actually reported. You can see from the map the two regions that are mostly targeted. The first region is in the center, the dark blue region, and that is the Drenica Valley of Kosovo. This is the birthplace and the stronghold of the resistance movement in Kosovo, so it was severely targeted. The second region, as you can see, the darker blue with the the clustering of red dots, that is the Jakova municipality of Kosovo, and that also had a large number of cases of wartime sexual violence. It has some of the largest numbers, not just of sexual violence, but missing persons to this day that are reported. And this is where I was located for my fellowship. Mediga Jakova is the organization that I worked with, which is a nonprofit organization, as I said, located in Jakova, Kosovo, that is committed to supporting survivors of wartime sexual violence through a variety of methods. First and foremost, they offer a lot of vital, sort of immediate and tangible assistance. And by this, I mean a lot of psychosocial counseling, legal counseling, health consultations, and economic empowerment programs. But in addition to these resources that are freely offered to survivors, Medica Jakova also engages in a wide diversity of human rights work. They engage in advocacy and lobbying to ensure the policy making that is being done is done efficiently and with survivors in mind. In fact, the data that was used in the previous map was based off of data that Medica Jakova collects. They also seek to destigmatize sexual violence by interacting with social communities in Kosovo throughout social media campaigns, protesting, hosting events, and conducting human rights workshops. In particular, this summer, I was incredibly rewarded by being able to speak to a lot of the more senior women who were working at Medica Jakova, the ones who kind of were there immediately after the war, and to hear about a lot of their experiences trying to engage with women. and the struggles they face. And because at this time, as I already explained, there wasn't a lot of international support and there wasn't a lot of state support locally in Kosovo. A lot of these women literally had to go into these villages and go knocking door by door and trying to get to talk to women in communities who did not want to speak about what happened, were too afraid, were too ashamed. Doors were slammed in their faces. People were unwilling to speak. Oftentimes, certain women, in misleadingly thinking they wanted to protect other women, wouldn't tell each other what was happening, would hide information. But Mediga Jakova, I think over time, with consistency and openness, eventually women privately and secretly started to seek them out. While in Kosovo this summer, I was able to assist and participate in several different human rights initiatives at Medica Jakova. I think that allowed me to better understand the needs of survivors, but also to really grasp the different levels in which civil society can help support those in need. First, I assisted with the preparing of a trauma training manual that would be used as part of a brand new initiative in Kosovo, which seeks to train Kosovo's public healthcare system. This initiative was partly and done because over the years of Medica working directly with survivors, what they discovered was that one big challenge that survivors often faced is that when interacting with medical professionals who were not equipped or informed enough to understand the trauma of wartime sexual violence and the sensitivities needed in order to properly engage and help survivors, it meant that professionals can sometimes would evoke harmful and hateful stereotypes and would violate their rights, and in doing so prevent survivors from getting or even seeking the services that they needed. So Medica Jakova eventually decided to collaborate with the Kosovo's Ministry of Health and the Kosovo University Clinical Center to implement this project. The training manual that I helped create by doing research and selecting materials for it is going to start with recently within the next few months with a pilot initiative that will train about 100 medical professionals in the Jakova and the present municipalities of Kosovo, with the hopes that the initiative will eventually overhaul the whole public healthcare system and train all of the medical professionals with the proper, I think, knowledge and skills to provide targeted resources of survivors of gender and sexual based violence. The next sort of way that I engage with human rights works is is through the Be My Voice campaign, which utilizes the digital sphere, media, and art to encourage Kosovo's public to openly discuss sexual violence and speak up for when survivors are not ready or may never be ready to speak up for themselves. This campaign, which was a collaborative effort between both Medica Jakova but other human rights organizations in Kosovo, started last year on June 19th, 2018, which is the first official United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. This year, for the 1 year anniversary of the campaign, I was there in June 19th. I was with Medica Jakova, and I was able to witness a lot of the urban artwork and the social media drive and the television experiences and all of the effort that both Medica Jakova and as well as all the other organizations had put into engaging the public, into forcing them, not forcing, but encouraging them to really talk about what was happening about this issue that is still so prevalent and still, as I showed you earlier on the map, despite there being almost 20,000 cases, there are only 280 that are reported. And by this, I don't mean publicly reported, like they're speaking out to, but just within private organizations, only 280 predominantly women are speaking about their struggles. Um, what was most, I think, fascinating about this campaign and provoking was to compare my experience in Kosovo and the willingness that people had to speak to me about sexual violence and the work I was doing for my fellowship in comparison to the conversations that I had with all of these senior employees at Medica Jakova and the experiences they had just 20 years ago, where people were entirely unwilling to engage with this topic. And I think a big part of the success of this campaign is that it doesn't ask survivors themselves to speak up. It doesn't ask them to share something that they're not ready to share or they don't want to share, but instead it encourages us to speak up instead and to inform each other and to have this dialogue. And I think that is very different to a lot of other social media campaigns we've seen, such as the Me Too campaign, which I think encourages sort of survivors and puts the burden, I think, on survivors themselves. Finally, a big thing that Medica Jakova does, and I was invited to join these, is host a lot of these women's human rights workshops. In particular, they're done in a lot of rural, remote areas where a lot of these women don't necessarily have access to a lot of resources and to big communities to have these sort of conversations. And I found the women there in these villages very open and very self-aware and reflective and very willing to talk about these difficult topics, which it was shocked me because it was not something I was prepared for. But in general, I think when you compare these three experiences, I think they provide a really strong sampling of the layers in which civil society engages in human rights work. The first is sort of collaborating with the state. The second is sort of collaborating as a whole with collective communities. And the last is sort of this one-on-one work with survivors themselves and people themselves. Um, the main goal, however, that I had when deciding to go to Kosovo was to best understand the human rights work that can protect and hurt survivors, is to study the recognition and verification policy in Kosovo. So back in 2011, the Kosovo passed the status and the rights of their martyrs, invalids, veterans, members of the Kosovo Liberation Army, civilians, victims of war, and their families, which is a mouthful, but the intention is to get as many people into this status, into this recognition as possible. And the framework recognized and determined the rights of these people who were engaging and impacted by the war. However, within this framework, there was no mention of survivors of wartime sexual violence. And the reason for this, it was assumed that these survivors could have just like gone under the category of sort of civilian victims of war. And what this does is that it overlooks the specific ways in which survivors of wartime sexual violence are harmed, and both during and after the war. So, for example, a survivor of wartime sexual violence, it may fear seeking medical help because of stigma, which is something someone who probably, broke their arm probably might not face. And by overlooking the way the harms of sexual violence differs, the law overlooked the specific rights of sexual survivors in order in needing to be protected. And then this overlooking became even more problematized when a year later, Kosovo then passed the official status of the Kosovo Liberation Army veterans. And this was done despite the fact that the veterans were already in the initial law. And the reason this was done was because they felt that veterans had this great sacrifice, and they have their own law, and they should be protected, and they should get their pension, they should be honored and treated with respect by society. And these were two of the existing frameworks that existed for quite a few years in Kosovo until 2016. And that was when, because of the advocacy work that individuals and NGOs and Medica Jakova did in Kosovo, they finally passed the recognition and verification of the status of sexual violence victim during the Kosovo War. The reason why I was most interested in studying about this, because it is unlike its kind pretty much anywhere, both in Kosovo as well as globally. It legally legitimizes the experience of wartime sexual violence. It also provides a pension for survivors in the same way a pension was offered to veterans, which financially makes possible for survivors to seek any support they may need, be that medical, psychological, economic support. It also increases social and political awareness of the issues. I think really complementing the Be My Voice campaign that was happening more on the social level. And finally, in the same way that a separate law was created to honor and respect the veterans who sacrificed by fighting, this law establishes respect and attempted to dignify survivors, which is something that stands in direct contrast, I think, to the oppressing and the silencing of survivors that were faced for so long. Because of the significance of the law and the influence it may have on policy making in other conflict areas, it was very important to me to learn as much as possible what were its benefits, but also if there was ways in which it wasn't really helping. And therefore, at Medica, I was invited to sort of go over the application process. And as these applicants were making their application for the status, I kind of would help with the application and listen in. And really, what I learned, I think, is that a lot of the time with the recognition, it falls, I think, prey to a lot of the many similar issues our own legal system has, I think, with cases of sexual violence. And by this, I mean one, sort of men were significantly less likely to apply because there's greater stigma of men as opposed to women. Two, when the woman would come in for the interviews in front of the council, any sort of lack of like outward emotion or lack of crying was sort of an indicator that perhaps they weren't that bothered or weren't that traumatized, or any inconsistencies in the application were sort of indicators of maybe they were lying or maybe something was off. And despite there being these issues, as a result of these issues, Kosovo decided to tackle them by ensuring that the council would be diverse, that on the council you would have a psychologist who had years of experience, for example, working in Kosovo and working with sexual violence. And by having this diverse council, you'd had more opinions and more perceptions that would be able to view the people. Um, so one of the biggest perceptions, if not stereotypes, I had before I went to Internet Medika Jakova this summer was that urban women would have a greater sense of empowerment than rural women and be more willing to work with Medika Jakova and speak out about the experiences. However, while I was there, that perception completely flipped on its head. When I encountered in fact was the exact opposite. Because rural women were more isolated and lived farther away from others, it meant that they had more privacy. They can go to the cities to find therapy appointments and not have to worry about being caught. Whereas women in urban societies would, because they were more part of bigger groups, were more afraid and less likely to engage. So it appeared to me that women from villages were isolated and this became a source of their access, whereas women from the cities had access and this became a source of their isolation. And the more time I spent in Kosovo, the more these sort of layers revealed themselves to me, and the more complicated my conceptualization of human rights became. But at the same time, that complexity was also very revealing, that human rights works exist in this sort of gray area of sometimes contradicting spaces, and this knowledge and this firsthand knowledge is something that I'm very grateful for this fellowship for allowing me to learn, and I'm confident I will use with the future human rights work. Thank you.